Friends to Terrorverse TV. My name is John Altarelli, and I will be your host today. If you like this content, please like, subscribe, and hit the notifications bell. Also, please provide your comments in the section below because we are interested in knowing whether this content is suitable or helpful and any other topics you want us to cover. My goal here is to provide some factual background with expert analysis. So I hope you enjoy. Today, we have a very special guest. We have Renata Parras. I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. She's an amazing person, a good friend of mine, and someone I think you'll find an expert on this topic. So Renata serves as counsel and advisor and expert on issues related to human rights, human trafficking, social impact, and relevant for today, immigration. She currently sits on the advisory board to the Noble, a network of financial service professionals, law enforcement, regulators, and NGOs who have joined forces to lead and innovate more effective ways to fight human crime. She is one of the founders of the National Survivor Law Collective, a collective of lawyers that represent human trafficking survivors. She sits on the advisory board to Mission Omega Survivor Council. She also sits on the board of Chrysalis Digital Assets, a company seeking to create blockchain solutions that promote transparency and trust in digital solutions. Renata was also the Environmental, Social, and Governance, or also known as ESG counsel, to the international law firm of Paul Hastings, where she focused on social impact, human rights, and strategic partnerships. Prior to that, she served at the firm's Global Pro Bono Council, where she led the firm's Modern Slavery and Human Rights Initiative and the Immigration Pro Bono practice. Prior to joining Paul Hastings, Renata spent her career with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, where most recently she served as Deputy Chief Counsel with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security in New York, where she led teams of attorneys that represented Department of Homeland Security in immigration court, human rights investigations, national security, denaturalization, and immigration litigation, and also provided legal service or legal advice to the agents of Homeland Security investigations. During her time at DHS, she was the beneficiary of 2 prestigious awards for protecting the homeland. This is a true patriot here. So before I know that because I know what you do. So before we get started, I want to disclose my bias. I am a son of legal immigrants, and I am very much pro-immigration. I am not fond, though, of the way our government has gone about doing that in an effective way to make America a great destination for immigrants, like my parents. And we're going to talk about today some of the history, some of the statistics, some of the background, some of the issues, and not be biased by left or right politics. These are just the facts, only the facts, and nothing but the facts. Because I have right here next to me Renata, who is clearly an expert on this, and we've done some research together to look at some of these issues. So we are going to bring those to bear, and you'll see we have notes in front of us because we don't like to just spout off things at the top of our head. There's a lot of data here, a lot of information. There's been a tremendous amount of laws and executive orders to cover. Most people only hear about a few, and they only hear about the ones that are appropriate for their bias. So, but before we get started on immigration, there is something that I'm aware of with Renata. We talked about this. We actually had one of my Terrorverse salons that you guys know about, where we had a documentary movie on the female tactical platoon of the Afghan security forces, which was something that was pretty interesting. Most people don't know anything about it. And then there was some serious immigration issues post our withdrawal, our hasty withdrawal from Afghanistan. So Renata, first of all, thanks for coming. Thanks for being with me. Why don't we start with that, because that's a story that's near and dear, I know, to your heart. When I found out about it, I mean, it just tore me up, and all the people that we have opened up to that are quite, they're quite surprised at our government.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here. And of course, everything that I say is the opinion of Renata. So we actually convened here watching a movie called Guerrera that these phenomenal women put together that documents their time together in Afghanistan. And when I say their time together, I'm talking about the U.S. military, Special Operations Forces, and in particular, a group of elite Special Ops women who worked for the first ever cultural support teams of the United States. And they served.
And we don't even have any Special Ops women in the U.S., is that, I think?
No, yeah, So the women who I work with, who you had here, are our female
Oh,
special
that's right.
ops.
We do
Yep.
have a. That's
Yep.
right. Okay, they trained them. That's right. I
Yep,
remember
they
that.
trained them. Yep. So they served alongside a group of Afghan women who were part of their first ever Afghan security force. And during the evacuation, those women became basically like target zero for the Taliban. So they were evacuated immediately. I got linked up with them, and it's been a privilege of a lifetime to work with not only those Afghan women who all came here, much the same as a lot of the other Afghan refugees who were evacuated to the United States. They were paroled into the United States and had all of the immigration needs that we're going to talk about today the minute they got here. So I've been working with the ladies from Special Ops and with the Afghan women for the last 2 years. I am incredibly happy to report that of 42 women, we have 39 asylum grants, and many of them are now coming up for green cards. But it's been a battle. It's been a battle, and we'll figure out why today.
But you know, when I first heard about it, I was like, "Are you kidding me? Why weren't they granted immediate status?" They were trained, vetted, worked side by side with our special forces, put their lives on the line, killed for us, and they couldn't get in. Yet we got a border that's wide open and people can just come across. And I found that to be startling.
You know, so look, I think one thing that I'm going to do today is try to level set a little bit, right, and really focus on law,
right?
Because there's a lot of fact and fiction when it comes to immigration. And with let's use the Afghan female tactical platoon as an example, they were able to come in, right? They were put on U.S. planes. They were brought to the United States. We exercised our parole authority, which is an authority that the U.S. Department of Homeland Security has to bring them into the United States. And the female tactical platoon were an example of essentially a loophole in legislation that a lot of people know about, which is the Special Immigrant Visa process, which is SIV.
I've heard of that, yep.
The SIV program was created to actually honor the men and women who serve alongside us overseas, both in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that was actually for individuals who worked for or on behalf of the U.S. government. These women worked for the Afghan government alongside U.S. troops, but really didn't immediately qualify. A few of them may have, but most of them did not qualify for SIV. And when they some of them put themselves into a refugee process, which we'll also talk about a little bit today. But once you come to the United States, you actually go from being a refugee to an asylee. So you're starting the process all over again. Since then, we've worked pretty tirelessly with a bunch of folks, and I'll give one group a shout out because I love them, With Honor. The With Honor nonprofit organization in DC have been next to us the whole time, working on trying to fix some of that stuff and really introduce legislation or language into existing legislation that would start to really include some of these missing individuals, very important missing individuals from some of these legal loopholes.
Yeah, for anyone that doesn't know about With Honor, they should look them up. But also, I met with some of them down in D.C. at that event, and there is, which you would never even expect, a bipartisan group of former military folks that are on both sides of the aisle in Congress who actually work together to do good stuff. So there are good people out there in Congress that are not so concerned about the politics, but about doing the right thing. And it's not surprising to me that they're all veterans, because veterans tend to stay out of politics. We care about the country, and we don't think that politics should get in the way of being, America. Anyway, so why don't we jump from that? And I'll try to put some links down in there for some of these things so that people want to get a little bit more educated about the female tactical platoon, the Herrera, the documentary. You want to watch it. You want to know anything about With Honor, or even that bipartisan committee in Congress. You might be surprised. There are a lot of good people out there. Why don't we start? The basic place to start, I think, and everything is to get some level setting on the statistics, right? And I know you brought a lot of notes, and feel free to use them because there's a lot of stuff thrown around out there, a lot of misinformation, a lot of people who assume that the world is not what the world really is. And I think the best place for anything to start is with some facts. So why don't we start with some basic stats around immigration?
Yeah, so I collected a bunch. I think you also collected a bunch.
Yeah. Well, I
I'm
do
like
research.
flipping to
That's the problem with
pages.
lawyers.
That's right. We have too much research. We should just probably talk.
Yeah, you're probably right.
But look, I'll spit out a couple of facts that I think are really, for me, they're shocking when you start to look at them, right? So first we have, and I just pulled these this morning, so they should be pretty up to date. 14% of the population, of the U.S. population, is immigrants. 11 million people are currently living in the United States without status. Now, obviously...
So immigrants, we stop there. So immigrants actually make up more than African Americans in terms of 12,
I don't
12%, right?
So
that's sort of our biggest, I would call it, minority group then, right? In America.
They're comparable. And if you think about if we know that 11 million people live here without status, I mean, most are not. That's from census surveys and whatever it is. You can only imagine how much higher that number is for people who are not, in fact, responding to those types of surveys.
Yeah, why would they?
Right. As far as the numbers this year, up to 281,000 visas have been granted already for foreign nationals coming to the United States in 2024 by the Department of State. We have, of them, 25,000 are employment-related visas, and we're going to go through the different kinds of visas, and 152,000 of them are family visas. There are about 969,800 people became U.S. citizens after going through the naturalization process in just the year 2023. And
so we did about 1 million legally. Is what you're
saying. 1 million new U.S. citizens. Okay. And the U.S. has 4 times the number of migrants coming into the United States than the next leading nation, which is, I believe, Germany.
Okay.
The migration population, number 1 from Mexico, and really has been for some time. Next is China and India, and that is a growing number. After that, they rank Philippines. Third, El Sal, Vietnam, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic, and Guatemala and Korea in that order. And then you go on from there, right? And then I think really importantly, and we'll talk a little bit about the immigration courts, and that's where I spent a lot of my time in windowless rooms. There are 2 million cases pending in immigration court. So that number should be shocking to people. Those are my stats.
So, but when I did some work, I mean, it looks like if you go back to the 1990s when immigration sort of ticked up to about almost 9.1 million over the 90s. So you're looking at 900,000 a year, and then it's been kind of steady at around 1 million a year for the 2000s, 2010s, and it looks like this year is on
track
for legal.
Yep.
But the number of illegals had just gone astronomical. So if we only had 3 to 5 million in the 80s, we had 8 to 10 in the entire 90s, we had 11 to 12 in the 2000s, and then 10 to 11 over the 2010s. And in just this 1 year, we have 8, 9, 10. I mean, so that in 1 year.
Right.
That's an entire decade.
Right.
So we're now tracking in 1 year or 2 years more than we normally do in illegal immigrants. Than we had in our entire history. So that alone
is huge. That's huge. It's huge.
Should raise flags. I mean, there's a problem.
Right.
We got to deal with that because that's just, we can't assimilate that many people anyway. I don't think.
And I want to just make a point too when it comes to talking about people who are living in the United States, illegal.
Right.
That is not just people who come into the United States illegal. It includes people who come here under some sort of legal means,
right,
and then they overstay,
the visas,
right? So they don't leave. Because oftentimes when people think of illegal immigrants, you're only thinking about individuals who have crossed into the United States across a border, through unlawful, between ports of entry is what we say. And nobody thinks about the fact that there's a whole host of people who actually come here legally, but then decide that they're going to overstay their visa and never leave.
That's probably the way I would do it.
Right. Well, that's the way a lot of people do it.
If I was going to do it, and look, if I was in some of these countries, I'd give it a shot myself. So I'm not against the desire of people.
People have their reasons. Yeah.
To come here, and I also, as I said this before, and I'll say it again, I believe most of the people that come here, the vast majority, if not, super majority of them, are just hardworking people in very, very dire situations around the world. While they may not meet the status of an asylum seeker, which is part of the problem, and they don't want to go through the lottery process and take their chances that way, are willing to risk everything to come here.
Yep.
I just don't blame them. So that's why I want a real policy. I want a rational policy, and then we'll talk later. We got to do something about who's already here. Okay?
Right.
We're not going to be able to kick them all out, so we better
Right.
come up with a plan, and we'll
Right.
talk about
Yeah.
prior amnesty and whether amnesty is the right thing to do. So why don't we?
Yeah.
So we did the stats.
Yeah.
Why don't we go from there? Let's see. Let's talk
Want
about
me to go
some of the
through
visas. Yeah, let's go over the visas.
Okay, so that's another area I think where a lot of people get confused. What kind of visas are out there? And for me, I break visas down into 4 categories. Family-based visas, so visas that you can get based on familial relationships, whether it's a spouse, a child, a brother or sister, whatever it is, family-based visas. The second is an employment visa. So anything that is somehow related to your, ability to be employed in the United States. The third is a category called special immigrant visas. So over years, which we just spoke about it with the Afghan women, Congress has basically given visas to special categories of people. Oftentimes it's followed conflict, right? So different types of war, conflict, where we're trying to allow in a certain number of individuals because of global crises.
So that's a number that we can just pick any year. So it's not fixed.
Those are fixed. But for certain categories.
Okay.
Most are fixed.
All right.
Most have numerical caps.
Okay.
And then the last one, which I think is I think more and more people know about it, but it's sort of fascinating and it's a total peacock, is the diversity visa lottery.
Yeah, I never heard about that until I did the research.
Most people don't know. It is a true lottery. It is a true lottery, and the reason for its creation was to essentially diversify the population of immigrants that we have coming to the United States. So we try to target countries that may not be represented through other visa categories. And it's an application that you put in, it's chosen at total random, and if you win, you have literally won the lottery. And the minute you step foot on U.S. soil, you become a legal permanent resident. It's a pretty phenomenal thing, and it's a total peacock in the visa world.
How big is that a year? Do you know?
There are numbers. I don't have the number, but it is capped. It's a capped visa. So when you think about the visa, okay, so I broke down categories,
Right.
but the other big distinction is the difference between an immigrant visa and a non-immigrant visa. So an immigrant visa, essentially think about it in terms of it's all about intent. So is your intent to come to the United States and permanently remain? That is an immigrant visa. You are immigrating to the United
Right.
States. A non-immigrant visa means that you are coming to the United States for some temporary purpose, but your intent is to depart the United States and keep residence, from wherever
Right.
it is that you came. So some examples of immigrant visas are those family-based visas that I spoke about before. So you have a U.S. citizen, their spouse is applying to join them in the United States. They file what we call an I-130 application for a family relative. That is an immigrant visa. Your intent is to come permanently relocate and live with your spouse. Other types of immigrant visas are things like fiancé visas. If you're adopting a child overseas and you're applying for an adoption visa. Other family members, so a parent or a child or whatever. There's a category of visas called e-visas, which some people are familiar with. The most common of them are investor visas. It's people who pay. They basically put money into U.S. investment. In exchange, they come on an e-visa, and that the intent is to stay here. And then some of these special immigrant visas that we spoke about, like SIV. The non-immigrant visas are the other categories that many people, know about. Things like a tourist visa, right? Somebody coming into the United States who's going to a business conference that lasts 2 weeks, and you have to show proof that you're coming to a conference and you're leaving. A J-1 cultural exchange visa. A lot of people know about the cultural exchange programs that a lot of young people in the world take advantage of. The F visas, which are student visas. You have D visas, which are for crew members. I was fascinated by this when I came to the United States.
That didn't show up
or
on my
when I
research.
went to Homeland Security. Yeah. The crew members get treated very differently under immigration laws because they're literally passing through seaways. So they have to have the ability to come to the United States, but leave, right? Then you have diplomats, right? So diplomats come to the United States on G and A visas, and the minute that their term expires, they're expected to leave. And then, of course, the P visas are for athletes. You've got the U visas for victims of crime, T visas for human trafficking victims. But I think the one that a lot of people, I mean, I save this purposely for last because it's always a topic, is the H visa. Right, the H-1B, which is essentially a foreign worker who's sponsored by their U.S.-based company to work here. That is considered a non-immigrant visa because really you're supposed to be here for a period of time. Either you're a skilled worker. I mean, there's different definitions and categories, but the idea is that you're coming here, you're working for that company, and when your employment ends, you're going.
Now, I assume most of these categories have some limitation per year, or not?
Yes. So. We would have to go through each one. Some of them have caps, and some of them do not.
Well, yeah, especially the ones where I guess where you're not going to be here permanently. They probably don't need
right.
caps.
So we do. We have. I think I wrote somewhere, but each country. Not only are there numerical caps on the kinds of visas, but there's actually caps on how many people from particular countries can get the visa. So I think it's like 7% can't be allocated to more than one country. So there's a whole host of numerical limitations on these things.
So if I was to stop right there, and I would say, wow,
right.
we have a very, very broad-based, phenomenal visa program or immigration program already in place to allow at least 1 million people a year in.
Yep.
Very diverse, because we don't try to skew to any one particular country. We even have that other category where you're actually the diversity visa lottery, right? On top of that, which is to make sure that people who are not getting in have even a better shot to get in. I don't know why people are complaining and saying that the United States is not an immigrant-friendly company, and we're the biggest immigrant country out there in terms of the numbers that we take in.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll tell you, as far as them, I have now worked on every side of this. Mm-hmm. I have worked in the U.S. government. Right. At DHS, the agency that has the authority to enforce immigration law.
Right.
I have worked at a nonprofit organization where I worked with unaccompanied minors, representing unaccompanied minors. I have worked in a private sector organization where we represented individual clients against the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Across the board, if you have a process that is so burdened and is kind of failing at certain junctures, I absolutely appreciate from every single entity's perspective that I just said, DHS, NGOs, private sector who's representing clients in immigration, the system is so burdened, it is so under-resourced, the backlogs are so massive, the time waits for these people sitting, waiting for adjudication of these applications, and it sounds good when you talk about it.
Right.
When it starts to carry out in practice, you start to appreciate how broken what sounds like, and is probably, if it was working properly, a good, robust process system starts to fail.
So the first thing that I would start with when we come later on about fixing the system is, how could it be, Renata, given the amount of money that every year we pass extra to fix it, right? You can look at, we talked about all these executive orders, every one of them came with money. Yep. They all come with money.
Yep.
And they all come with more enforcement. They all come with more agents, more this, that, and the other. The bureaucracy, the Homeland Security didn't even exist, right? So all this stuff is like new. We have more and more people working for the government. How is it that we can't get, how is that, why is that backlog? Is that purposeful, do you think?
Renata's opinion.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I'm always that kind of skeptic. When I see these things, I'm saying.
Right. I think the only thing that anyone can agree on right now is that the system is broken. Right? Outside of that, the immigration policy and immigration processes, immigration in the United States has become so political and is such a political issue. People feel very passionate about it. It's a values-driven issue. It's been weaponized by administrations against whether it's people. It creates opportunity for backdooring for other types of policy.
I want to get to that in a minute. Yes.
Right. And it's also incredibly reactive, which makes any program susceptible to failure. Right. It's when global crises hit, which we have had an unprecedented number of global crises over the last 4 years. If you think about, let's talk about an already broken system that was entirely overburdened and backlogged, and real plug for the men and women of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, USCIS, the agents, they are trying their absolute best to keep up with what they're drinking from a fire hose every day. The fact of the matter is they took a broken backlog already, right, and then you put the pandemic on top of it, right? Then you put Afghanistan on top of it. Then you put the Ukraine invasion on top of it, where we came out with a Uniting for Ukraine program. Right. Now, you've got an election year where everyone is, starting to try to put in place programs. So that's number one, it's a reactive system. And every time a crisis, something gets uploaded into a system that's already failing, it just creates more and more issues, and we can't keep up. And then number two, I think really when it comes to again, I always used to say when I was in Homeland Security, and the lawyers who worked with me know this, and they'll laugh if they watch this, because I used to say it all the time. We were executive branch employees. We were there to carry out policy, regardless of what we thought about them. We had our personal opinions, but you're there to carry out policy. When you spend 4 years of your life enacting one policy, right? And the enactment of any policy takes a long time. It doesn't happen overnight. You spend 4 years trying to put in place an executive order, and then somebody comes in and goes, that thing that you were just doing for the last 4 years? We're going to now flip it on its head, and you got to do the opposite. That is just a waste of governmental resource.
Yeah.
When it's that extreme. And we've seen that, and we'll get to some of it in our policies.
I had a personal experience with that with the Department of Education. We spent, 4 years or 3 years trying to save some schools that were going to go bankrupt. 90,000 students, 93 campuses. One of the biggest failures in private history or private institutions in the government. And we spent 3 years negotiating this incredibly detailed and wonderful plan to save them and to forgive student loans, private student loans, by the way, not government student loans. And we came up with this massive deal. It cost my clients millions of dollars to implement, tens of millions, maybe even hundreds of millions. I forget how much. It was a lot of money. And then they had the change of administration. They literally came in.
And they took your deal and threw it
away.
They
were signed. These were signed agreements. And they said, well, we didn't really mean that. I'm saying, what do you mean you don't mean? It's written right here.
Right.
And they don't care.
Right.
Because what are you going to do?
Right, you're not going to do anything. And I mean, look, and there's multi-layers to that, because that's not just, first and foremost, it's taxpayer, it's governmental resource. Number two, think about what that does for the culture and the morale of an agency, for the leadership, for attrition, for retention, for recruitment.
Well, how do you work in any of these areas if you are subject to the change of administration changes all the rules without the laws actually changing? Right. These are just, implementation,
right? Exactly. It's agency policy.
It's agency policy, and they're absolutely over the top, and they need to be reeled in for sure. And by the way, I think the executive orders, I've said this many times, I don't think that's right. That's legislation by the executive branch, and that's wrong as well.
Well, we'll get to that.
So one other thing before we leave the topic of this sort of broken system. Outside observers like me over the years, and I've looked at lots of immigration stuff. I've had many clients. We've tried all these programs. I mean, I always thought of these things as kind of scams because people were getting around the normal immigration process. So I've always been a fan of, look, my parents came in under the standard procedures, okay? And as do most of the people I knew, because they didn't have all these programs. They didn't have the ability to get a sponsored by by a company or an H-1B visa or any of the EB visas. All these things were not available. So they've kept coming up with these categories, and yet people still get around it with, you've got fake marriages, right? And then you've got fraud. You got anchor baby things, which is a whole other issue. I mean, people don't understand it. We should tell people what anchor babies really mean, because it's not really, you don't really get your parents in there. They have to wait like 21 years. They have to be 21 years old before they can apply.
You can petition.
But the parents stay here, and there's no reason to kick them out. I mean, no one tries to kick them out. So there's no enforcement. Okay, they're not legally here, but no one's kicking the parents out. So I know that's been an issue. So people that don't understand that one, that's sort of a difficult one, because it's not quite what either side says. People don't get in because they have a baby here.
Right.
Coming here to
well,
get a baby.
to that, you just made a very good point. Let's dispel one myth.
Yeah.
Let's dispel myths as we go.
No, I want to, because I don't want people to, to keep believing this baloney, because it affects our ability to do rational stuff about immigration, which is what we should be doing.
And this is something that I speak to quite frequently when I do a lot of work with the human trafficking community.
Right.
And it comes up a lot as far as the when is law enforcement going to enforce their immigration authorities against an individual, right? And in the context of human trafficking survivors, it's very infrequently. Homeland Security investigations is very specific about the fact that when you're classified as a human trafficking survivor, they are not going to, charge you and put you in immigration proceedings. So, but the idea that everybody is vulnerable, I think, is where you come. And when I say everybody, I mean people who are here illegally. It comes back to this conversation about resources, right? And essentially prosecutorial discretion, which is something inherent when it comes to the enactment of any law. When there is a lack of resource and you just cannot get to everything, you have to prioritize. Naturally, right? So you're going to start, whether it's formalized, like it was under one of the administrations that we will talk about, or whether it's thrown in the garbage later, there is a natural process of prosecutorial discretion that happens just because there are not enough women bodies, man bodies, and time and resources to go pick people up and put them in immigration detention or proceedings. Yeah.
And I assume most of the people in the enforcement side, they're rational.
They are rational people
they're
doing their best, but also they are charged with carrying out the laws of the United States, and they just have to prioritize because there's not enough hours in the day, not enough time, not enough detention space. And so historically, there's been a ranking of individuals that are of interest to the U.S. government before they can get to things like picking up the good mom up the street who's been living here for 30 years, hardworking, raised her kids, paying her taxes.
And the kids are
U.S. citizens or not, right? There's national security threats. There's human rights violators, the group I worked in. Yeah. There's violent felons. There's a rank and order.
Right. So it makes sense. Look, the police have the same thing, and prosecutors always have the same thing until we politicize it. Like in New York City, you live here, you know how it is.
Yep.
When they said we're not going to prosecute anybody for any kind of crimes.
Right. I mean, and that's the opposite extreme, right? And
by the way, the cops already knew what to prosecute, who to pick up and who didn't pick up. They're not looking at nonviolent stuff. They're not going to, they see a kid shoplifting, they're going to call their parents, and the parents are going to take care of it. I mean, you don't really need to do what they're doing. But when people are looting and there's this mass,
right, then you're
and then you tell the cops they can't do anything about it.
Detention to yourself.
Yeah. So
we'll get to that too.
Yeah, all right.
The state-federal conflicts.
Well, that's an issue. All right. So why don't we roll? We talked about some of the stats. We talked about the visas. Do you want to talk about maybe asylum?
Well, so that's a big one, because I think when you're talking about the visa system and you have all of that going on, right? At the same time that you have what I think of as a parallel universe, which is the asylum universe. And the asylum universe is, so we are signatories to the Convention Against Torture, right? This comes from World War II, Holocaust law, essentially, where we have signed on to a convention and implemented into law the fact that we will not return individuals to countries that are going to be persecuted. And that is mandatory. There are due process rights that individuals have where the U.S. has to provide them some level, depending on situation, some level of audience or hearing where we will hear them out to hear whether or not they qualify for asylum. Important distinction that people don't realize. Refugee is somebody outside of the United States. Asylee is somebody inside of the United States. Okay, so by definition, you are availing yourself of the refugee process when you're living in a foreign country and going through the U.S. Refugee Assistance Program. When you're in the United States and you have fear, you file for asylum. And once that's granted, you become a refugee.
Okay.
So the asylum law is that if you are afraid, if you can demonstrate that if you are returned to your country, you will be persecuted, which is a definitional term, based on race, ethnicity, religion, particular social group, the United States cannot send you back to that country.
Okay.
And then if you have a crime, let's say you have a felony, let's say you have a felony conviction, you become only eligible for something called withholding of removal, which means we can't remove you, but you're under final order of removal, or the Convention Against Torture, CAT relief, if anyone's ever heard of CAT. So because there is this whole other legal mechanism that necessitates that the United States provide those individuals that are alleging fear this due process, that entire universe creates a whole other strain on the U.S. immigration system. And it's also uncapped. Because it's legal, it's a legally mandatory mechanism by which we cannot, it doesn't matter if you're John, Renata, whoever you are, we will not send you back to your country of origin if we believe you're going to be tortured. Right. That means that you can't say, well, we're only going to allow 5,000 people to be granted asylum. So that system has no cap, and it creates a very it's very important. I am a protection law girl, but it also creates a large strain, huge strain, and a lot of the stuff that we've heard about over the last couple of years and under the former administration related to that, because when you think about border security and you think about the number of individuals that present themselves to our U.S. ports of entry, and you also think about the fact that everyone knows we are signatories to the convention, you can apply for this thing called asylum. If you walk up to a Customs and Border Patrol officer and they're asking you who you are and you say, I'm very afraid, I cannot go back to El Salvador, that triggers a process that those agents have to go through and the officers of USCIS have to go through before you can put that individual on a bus or plane back to their home country.
But now they're not doing that at all. Is that correct?
Well, they have tried to create systems that expedite that. So they're not saying, they can't say that we are not hearing you out at all. But what has been done now is there's been some restrictions on it by day based on sheer numbers. They have risen the burden of proof for a credible fear interview. So there have been attempts to raise the burdens, make it quicker, more expedited, tighten up those processes.
But when people are throwing away their, because I looked at a lot of films and actually was supposed to go to Arizona myself, to the border. One of our friends did go, and he was telling me what was going on there. But they're throwing away their IDs, so you don't even know where they're coming from. You can't. Doesn't that make it very difficult to decide what country to even send them to or their asylum?
It's not only hard, it immediately creates what we said was a national security threat because you don't know who that person is. At that point, you have no clue who that person is. And that is actually under U.S. law, it is a threshold issue that you be able to prove who you are. There is a presumption that you are essentially an alien, a foreign-born national, if you cannot demonstrate otherwise, right? The burden of proof is always on the immigrant.
But that can't be being
enforced,
enforced,
for very small categories.
Because that can't be being enforced, and they should be sending everyone back. Because they're throwing away their IDs. How could they prove it?
Right. Well, but, if the person is, it creates a very, look, it's a complicated, imagine that Customs and Border Patrol agent.
I get it. They're putting them in an impossible position. But also, I thought I was hearing, and I've been watching a lot of these things and talking to some people, that they give you a court date, right? Mm-hmm. And then they release you into the country. And then if you don't show up, how they find you? Okay,
so now we're going to, so that's a natural segue in talking about two of our, So there was, I'm sure everyone has heard of catch and release.
Yes.
Right? And then the next administration didn't like catch and release, right? So we had a situation at the border where what that means is if you are an individual where you are, let's say, so we have ports of entry. I'm not going to assume everyone knows what we're talking about. Right. Nogales. Nogales. There's known Laredo, Texas. We have ports of entry that are manned and stationed, and they're real border points. The areas in between ports of entry are where, you see all of the news, people crossing the Rio Grande and coming into areas that are not manned by official ports of entry. Under U.S. law, if you come through between these two ports of entry, right, there have been various now policies that say what you do with an individual who has come through a border where they didn't present themselves properly to be admitted and inspected at a port of entry. Catch and release was that we would actually bring that person in. We would figure out who you are, look at your identity document, paper you, place you in removal proceedings, but not detain you. We would essentially, unless you had something like prior removal orders, criminal matters that we knew about, whatever it was. And they would be basically released into the country awaiting their immigration hearing. So, and immigration backlogs are 3, 4, 5 years. Yeah. Right? So, and by that time, individuals have settled here. They've been reunited with their families. They've basically accrued equity in the United States, all sorts of stuff. Under so catch and release was mostly spoken about, I think, during the Obama administration. When the Trump administration came in, one of the first things they did was, I don't know if it was the first thing they did, but it was fairly thereafter, was say we are no longer going to do this catch and release. We're going to do what really the law says, which is that these individuals are violating U.S. law by crossing into the United States at an illegal, not port of entry. Right. And we are going to detain those people. Right. So they are not going to, it was catch and detain, right? I don't know if anyone said that.
That was sort of the tent city issue, separating the children, right?
Because that policy was, we're not releasing you into the United States because once we release you, you're in the wind.
You're in the wind, exactly. I mean, I don't know that detention was the greatest outcome, but I don't know what else you could do. Otherwise, you send them back to Mexico.
Right. It's very well, and so some, Mexico's different. We won't get. I'm an immigration geek, so everything you say has a response.
I know, and it's the nuance. And
Mexico is the only country that we really voluntarily return people to. They can go turn them around and go back.
But if they're not from Mexico.
No, then they have to, then there has to be a process, right? Okay. So that was the conflict was with catch and release. People were basically being put in immigration proceedings, sent into the interior of the United States. I don't know what percentage. I'm sure data's out there to demonstrate how many of those people actually showed up at their future hearings. And under the Trump administration, they started detaining people. And so historically, what people will remember is that was the genesis of the family separation.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a horrible situation, but I don't know. There wasn't a lot of great solutions either. So I feel sorry for everyone involved because, the children in particular. But the parents did put them in that position, so you have to sort of, there's consequences, right? And if you make that trip and you know that could be the case, then you probably should think about that. But,
well, I mean, and John, I think one of the difficult parts of being an immigration attorney, right? I have a lot of people talking to me about immigration all the time. That time period was really difficult for so many reasons, right? Family separation. And at the time, I don't remember actually, I was in Homeland Security at the time, but there was still the effects of family separation when I got to the law firm where we were representing, unaccompanied minors. And I think that was a very good example of how the American people were not receiving, I think, a very clear explanation of why some of those things were happening. There were some of it was policy and administration and executive orders, but some of it was law. There was, the Flores settlement agreement, there were issues that DHS had to, and Health and Human Services during that time really had, there were court orders and there were all sorts of things that mandated that once you put in place this policy, these things were going to happen, right? And one of the things that was going to happen is that under the Flores settlement agreement, you can't actually detain children in the United States in detention facilities for more than a certain number of days. And so just think about the logic there, right? You've got a family, you've got a mom and dad, and you have a kid coming into the United States. You're affecting a policy that is, we're not catching and releasing, we're catching everyone. So you've got mom in a shelter, you've got dad in a detention facility, and you've got the kid in the detention facility, and then you're reaching you don't want the child. You can't have the child in the detention facility. And so Health and Human Services, who basically run the child facilities, had to be ready to absorb all of these children because they couldn't stay in these detention facilities with their families. So anyway, my point is, not to get too in the weeds on families because we could talk for 20 hours.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
But that was a good example, I think, of how there could have been much better explaining to the American people about why some of that stuff.
Yeah, but it wasn't convenient when you're trying to make arguments.
That's what it is.
Politically,
right, yeah.
It wasn't convenient. So why don't we? Because we still have about 15 minutes left. I want to still cover a couple of things. I want to cover sort of the sanctuary cities, New York. And then maybe quickly touch on the executive orders, past amnesty program. We got, try to do 4 or 5 minutes on each. So we'll start with the sanctuary city issues as a result of all this and what's going on in those cities.
Yeah, well, you can use New York as a good example, right? So, what that means is that there are states that have said that they essentially will not enforce immigration law. They won't be the enforcer of immigration law. And the natural end to that is a non-cooperation with federal law enforcement. So let's say Renata is in court for a drunk driving citation. If the state police, if NYPD knows that Renata is actually from Guatemala, they're not going to in a sanctuary city environment, the state policy would essentially say that the state PD cannot take into consideration their immigration status. They shouldn't be alerting ICE to the fact that that Renata is in court so that they could come pick her up on immigration authority. There's a non-cooperation essentially between state law enforcement and federal law enforcement.
And to be clear, what we're saying is the states have decided they're not going to follow the law.
The states have basically taken I can use an example of New York City, that it would basically, the state would be saying it's not our job to carry out immigration law, right? So it's your job, and where the tension arises is when there's a scenario where you're not asking them to carry out federal law, but you're also not you're not alerting them to the fact that
so there's no cooperation between the state and federal agencies, which you typically do in every other area.
Right.
Criminal
now,
cases.
and so sanctuary city, that whole situation has been the subject of massive litigation across the United States. I can think of at least 8 or 9 across the United States. And so it's part of that so now you have a confluence of issues here in New York, right? Because you have a sanctuary city under the Trump administration. I'm sure everybody remembers that one of the responses by the federal government was, well, if you're going to do that, we're not going to give you federal funding, right? So withdrawing funding. And you have this polarization of position. You have some of these governments, state governments, in New York now, where they're busing individuals up to New York saying, here you go, this is what you want, right? So now in New York, we have the sort of crisis situation that we have here because New York, being known as sanctuary city, other governments knowing that New York takes this position, are bringing individuals here, and the confluence is with the asylum process. So you have individuals who are now applying for asylum who are in this massive backlog, and so nothing's advancing. There's restrictions on work authorization documents for certain periods of time, so they can't go work because they don't have a work permit. And then on top of all of that, you have New York City is bound by this covenant that essentially requires it to provide housing for individuals who are in New York and who don't have shelter and now who are applying for asylum.
Right. Well, and that has led to in New York, I know, because they're giving food, shelter, medical care, and to some extent cash even. And you can see it all over the city. And then, of course, the city in New York, unfortunately, and I think other cities are doing well, they're trying to hide what's going on. So, they've actually paying ridiculous amounts for these hotels in the city, where they're putting them up in actual hotels, then they're showing pictures of the insides. They're trashing the hotels. And it's not because people are intentionally they're bad and they're trashing. I mean, just think about if you come from a country where you don't really eat American food, and now you have to eat American food, and that's not really going to be helpful to your digestive system, whatever.
Oh, no,
So they want to cook. They want to, and by the way, they don't have a lot of money, so they're going to be.
Difficult.
They want to cook in their rooms with a hot pot. I don't blame them.
No,
you know. So it's not. It's crazy. I mean, these people are in tough positions, and they've been living on the road.
Yes.
Now you put them in a hotel room, that's not going to be that easy to assimilate. So I get that. And then getting a job, you can't get a job without a green card. So what are they doing? They're doing the Uber Eats and all the food deliveries on little motorcycles. And it's a problem. And I know we're just going to knock this one out now. We talked about, or I wanted to talk about it at some point, but the statistics are not there on whether there's displacing jobs and whether the criminal activity is higher than an average. But that's historical.
Yep.
And that's when we're only bringing 1 million regular immigrants and 1 million illegal immigrants.
Right.
Now that's a 10x that number. It's not surprising to me that both of those categories, in retrospect, are going to show some amount of effect on jobs, and some effect, even more so, probably on crime. Not because they're bringing in criminals, but because you're putting people in situations where, maybe they have to commit crimes to survive.
Right. I mean, and just by sheer numbers, right? Those rates are going to go up with the populations going up. I think that I won't sleep tonight if I don't say that I have worked now with a number of sort of refugee populations, right? And getting to know that there is a kind of refugee experience that is really horrible. And I think that, and I get the fact that they've come here more often than not, there's a dire situation that has led them to that. And I know there are exceptions to every rule, right? But I'm just talking about some of my clients and some of the people who I've grown to absolutely love. They wish they were home, right? But home became kind of untenuous, whether it was poverty or they had homelessness or things that are not asylum, and they felt forced displaced, and that gets even worse when you're talking about you can put aside maybe some of the kind of economic migration.
Right.
I talk about countries like African countries and Afghanistan. It's like but the problem is once they come here, the situation creates because of the backlog and the waits and the inefficiencies and the kind of lack of ability to mobilize, to get people in and out fast. Like if you don't qualify, you should go, right? But they're staying for 4 or 5 years, but they're staying under less than ideal conditions. That starts to breed a desperation that I do see starts to feed itself in a really bad way.
Well, as a sort of quasi-conservative libertarian, I've always hated all of the situations where our systems are designed, frankly, to hurt the least powerful, the least able to protect themselves. And even this, because I know a ton of people smugly have gamed the immigration system to get here that
there
did not go
so
through
much fraud.
any of this shit.
Well, that's another
right?
thing. Like the fraud, the people who are committing fraud are ruining it for others, right? And there's a lot of fraud.
And if you've got a little bit of money, you get a good lawyer, you can get through the system, whereas these people have no chance.
Go sit in immigration court in New York City for a week.
I can't do it. I'd just kill myself. So we got another few minutes. I want to cover, we did cover a lot of ground. We didn't cover everything I wanted to cover, but maybe we'll do another one.
Oh, we can do 2.0.
I know we could do 2.0. But let's talk about, just quickly, take a couple minutes on the orders recently. What was changed between Trump and Biden? And then I do want to comment on the proposed legislation, because there's been a lot of misinformation around that, whereas the Democrats are saying, the Republicans killed it. It was going to solve the problem. When I looked at what was going to get done, it didn't solve the problem at all.
Right.
And so to suggest that the Republicans killed something that was going to solve the problem is disingenuous at the beginning. And frankly, I think this whole thing was just a smoke and mirrors game by the Biden administration to sort of make up for the fact that they had a horrible track record on just numbers. Forget about policies, just numbers alone. Somebody's got to take account for that, okay?
Yep.
So do you want to compare those to two presidents in terms of their executive orders and where we sort of ended up? I don't know if you
are we going with the two last presidents?
Yeah, just the two last presidents.
Yeah, I mean, look.
You could go all the way back, but there's been a lot of this stuff out there.
Yeah, well, the last two, because we won't have time to go farther back than that. Look, I spoke already about the prior Trump administration's detention policies.
Right.
And the Biden administration has, of course, changed that, right? So there's
Right.
been a return back to more of the prior policies under catch and release, with some changes. I have found this administration to be very, things are hard. It's hard to keep up with some of the changing executive orders. I think the big one worth mentioning is the current administration's change with DACA, right? So they came in and they've really tried to implement. You said something earlier that made you sound like the Ninth Circuit, which was the challenge to DACA. So essentially, that DACA, the legal challenge to DACA under the Obama administration was that policy. It was essentially a circumvention of what should be legislation, right? That they were rulemaking and that they shouldn't have. And so that was challenged. It was enjoined. And then challenged again. The Biden administration has tried to get around that by enacting essentially a final. They enacted a final rule to make it look to do rulemaking
under administrative rulemaking.
Right. So now DACA recipients can continue to renew their DACA. There's still it's still enjoined as far as the ability to apply for DACA anew. They will accept it but not adjudicate it. But the renewability under the Biden administration is one noticeable change from the Trump administration. The big one is this bill. Are you talking about the bill, the border security bill? Yeah. So this new bill that's been proposed basically presents a series of triggering events where the border can be shut down.
Right, but isn't that above what the numbers were already today?
Right.
So it's like a joke, right?
And so it's over 4,000 migrants on an average of 7 days. It is a triggering event, right? Or more than like 8,500 in a single day. There's numbers in there that allow them to shut down the border. But it's in there. It says that CBP would still need to process 1,400 legal migrants that are coming through ports of entry. So it's not a total shutdown, of the border. If you attempt to cross the border twice, you've got a ban. So if we catch you twice, so we reject you the first time and you come back again, there's this ban that comes. You will be rewarded essentially under this new border security policy. You would be rewarded if you go through a lawful port of entry.
Okay.
So
that's actually a nice thing.
Right.
I like
so
that.
you get entrance and you would get
At
what's
least we
called
can track
OSUP.
the system, right?
Right. We would release you on an order of supervision.
Okay.
Unlawful entry, you're detained.
All right.
And the asylum removal process kicks in. And then what I was talking about earlier is in here, there's been an attempt in this bipartisan bill to change the credible fear standards. So to try to really zone in on that asylum process that we spoke about and how do you make that more efficient? And some of it is they have heightened the standard of proof. They've created new timelines. I'm skeptical. If Renata's opinion again, I'm skeptical because they're essentially creating another process that it maybe will work and then it won't because the backlog is going to just start to create and you're creating a parallel process, There's also this H visa change where the family members of H visa can now apply. So that was another change. And then there is important to me. There is a actual entire part of it that relates to the Afghan allies. So there's been another attempt to introduce that into another bill because it's now been placed in 3 or 4 bills and not passed.
Okay. All right. So we're sort of running out of time. So I think what I would like to do to wrap it up is I'm going to give my 2 cents on what we've identified a lot of the problems. Okay. And it was actually worse than I thought.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been doing this research. I'm saying, wow, there's a lot of issues here. But you actually, and we didn't even cover a tenth of it, right? We're just tip of the iceberg. But what I did get mostly out of this is the resource issue.
Yes, big.
The resource issue alone could solve a lot of this problem. Seems to me we already have a lot of good laws. Or at least they're operative. They could work if enforced correctly. Resource is a problem. I think, for me, I think we're going to have, even though Reagan was the last person in '86 to do an amnesty, I don't see any other way around solving this problem without another amnesty program. You're going to have to
start over. Yeah.
You're going to have to say, okay, we got 10 million people. Okay, let's bring them all in. Let's document them. Let's figure out who they are. Let's put them on a 10-year, 5-year period where if they don't screw up and they become citizens and they do what they're supposed to do. And, you know, I would do like even Reagan. They had to learn English. I mean, you know, let's get them to become American. You know, because part of what we're having here is this whole, you know, diverse, you know, it's, the melting pot used to be like my parents, just so you know, my parents did not speak Italian in the house because they wanted we wanted to be English. We wanted to be American. And they did everything they could to become American as fast as humanly possible.
Yep.
That is completely the opposite now.
Yep.
People want to keep their own identity. They want to keep their own moral system, their own values, their own codes. And that is never going to work because even I love being multicultural. We're the most diverse country in the world, okay? And that's the best thing about us. But everyone that comes here comes to be an American or used to come here to be an American, which is not a particular thing. It's not an ethnic group.
Right.
Okay? It's not, oh, we're going to come here to be white.
Right.
Anglo-Saxons.
Yeah.
It's about values.
Yeah.
So you need, those values should not be thrown away.
Right.
So if everyone subscribes to the values, which is our legal system, right? All the things that make us great, then I don't care. And by the way, be bilingual, great. I wish my parents had taught me Italian as well. Would have been nice. But you need to be American. And part of the things about America is we do have a national language. Okay, we should stick to that. Okay, it's not going to be easy if we have to deal with how those. I mean, schools are struggling to teach kids with. You know, in New York City, you got to have 100 languages, literally 100 languages. And if you think about how many countries are represented in New York City, how do you deal with that?
Yeah.
And those poor kids.
Yeah.
How are they going to learn? It's not going to happen. So you can't just assume that you can deal with that by making schools, you know, be bilingual and the like. Because then you're only going to cover one or two other groups. You're not going to cover the whole world. And is that fair?
Right.
Should we only do people from Latin America? Should we only do Spanish-speaking people? Should we you know some of the Muslim languages? I don't know, but it certainly is not going to be fair to everybody else, and we're not going to be able to cover 100. So to me, there was nothing wrong with having people learn English, and that should be the same thing. They should learn the history of our country, the same thing, all the tests we've always had. And I don't want to make it hard for people. But by the way, most people that come here, they want to be American anyway.
Yep.
You know, they've already won our culture because they wouldn't come here otherwise. So I'm okay with that. I do think though we need to have a rational cap per year, period, with fair amount, just a little bit of leeway for certain edges and circumstances, because otherwise we're going to be doing this over and over again. If the asylum numbers don't have a cap, then everyone's going to be an asylee, right? I mean, why not? And so to me,
that's a tough one to put a cap.
So it is tough, but I think you have to. I don't think it's a choice. I don't think, you know, if 60% of the world's in poverty and 60% of the world has issues where the people are fearing for their lives, what are we going to do about that? We cannot take in 60% of the world. It just can't be. So there's going to be tough calls like anything else, but we can't be the destination source for everyone in the world. And I think we can do things maybe to help these other countries out. We've been trying to do that. We put a lot of money. That was in that last act, by the way, but the Democrats put more money to
That's the one thing, right? Like, I mean, you and I work together. And, you know, we've done stuff in other capacities. There's two things. One is addressing root causes of issues. How do we start to look at what's leading people to this and putting money into that, right? Let's see. But two is the other topics and other issues have had these calls for private sector engagement. This is going to be like my plug because
I think that's a good idea.
Like they have tech sprints. They have they fund, the government puts money out and a call for private sector visionary engagement to help resolve issues. There have been calls for something related to immigration, but nothing that I've seen like this. We need data solutions. We need to figure out how to make our systems more like we need private sector principals and programs that are willing to come in and help some of this stuff. Because some of this stuff some of it can become more efficient through tools that you and I know about.
I think, you know, I know you're involved in some blockchain and some AI issues, and I am too.
Needs to come
I think that should be a massive way of helping, because you can now track people better and all that. So identify people better, facial recognition and all that stuff. So I think there is technology that can help. I think if I was to, you know, provide incentives, I would provide incentives for private sector to invest in other countries rather than have to deal with it here, which costs more. So I'm all on board with that. So we're going to wrap up here. But before I wrap up, I just want to say, anyone that watches this, if you don't get that I'm sitting in a room with probably the most experienced, knowledgeable person on immigration. And I've watched a ton of shows, a ton of podcasts, a ton of news shows. I know a lot of immigration lawyers. I've dealt with these issues myself for years, and I have never met anyone, Renata, and I mean, I say this so sincerely, even though we're friends, that is more on top of this than you and can speak to it so clearly and objectively. And plus, you have all sides of the coin covered, from the government to NGOs to private sector. Very few people can have that. So for all you other newscasters, experts, pontificators out there, pundits, for a small fee of $1 million, I
will point you in the direction of a colleague who knows a lot.
I will have Renata come on your show and educate you in a real way, and stop without any political point of view, but someone who actually deeply cares about immigration, about the government's participation in it, about the immigrants' participation in it. And thank goodness we have people like her out there. And I'm a big fan of immigration. I'm a big fan. I am an immigrant. Everyone in America should be a big fan of immigration, because somewhere along the line they were immigrants. And that's why I don't understand people. I don't understand the people that think they're going to just close the border forever. That's not going to happen. And anyway, so she may be available. May be expensive, but
thank you. We need to do 2.0. We'll do 2.0.
We'll do 2.0, but maybe they could just make a donation to some of the great organizations that you work with. But I think, if you really want to talk to someone who knows something, Renata's the person. I'm just
I'm happy to geek out with anybody on immigration issues.
I'm just the vessel to get that information to you. So we'll try to do more of this. We may do 2.0. There's some other things that Renata and I are working on that we may talk about. And as you know, this is what I'm trying to do with this station, is to bring in people like Renata, who really know what they're talking about and can give information to people so they can make informed decisions, and they can stop, being swayed by the politics of the situation. It's not a political issue. It's a human rights issue.
That's right.
Okay, and it's
and
about our country.
A national security issue.
It's national security, and it's about our country. It's about who we are. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
Okay, thanks, Renata. Like, comment, tell us what you think, subscribe, and we'll see you on the next show. Thank you very much.